We are live and we should be seen and we should have people starting to join us. Let me just make sure that we are good. All right. Welcome to everybody. We have a couple of viewers online. It might just be me and Rachel. Hopefully, there's Jessica Scott. It's good to see you here with us. Friends, we are here for the very first night of our Advent church-wide study, and we're going to be making our way through the book Almost Christmas, a Wesleyan Advent Experience. And we're really honored and privileged tonight to welcome our friend, Magrey deVega, Reverend Magrey deVega, who's a senior pastor at Hyde Park United Methodist Church in Tampa. So, Magrey, we're glad that you're here. Thank you for joining us, and we'll have a few introductory conversations with you in just a second. Friends, if you want to go ahead, Magrey.
I'm delighted to be with you, Pastor Charlie, and Rachel and Alyce, and everybody who's on the call right now. Hello, Jessica, and just grateful to be with you all tonight.
Excellent. Thank you. Guys, as we get going, as you're watching along, I just want to remind you all that these studies work best whenever you put a wee bit of effort in from wherever you're watching. And the way that we do that is by offering comments in the comments feed there. So we've had Jessica, Marilyn, and Willie are joining us, and Mary has joined us. They've all said hello. There are a few others in the room, and we welcome you to say hello as well. Leonard and Cheryl, we're glad that you're here also. So what we're going to do is we're going to maybe open with a prayer, and then we'll just get our conversation going and see where we go tonight. So let's pray together. And gracious God, we do give thanks for this evening, for this time of year when we come together in this way, and we give thanks for this book that is really going to guide and take our thoughts on a journey this Advent season. Would you go before us? Would you call us toward you, and would you give us eyes and ears to see you and hear you in our conversations? We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
All right, guys. Well, we're going to try and have our conversation and get it started here. And Magrey, we're really going to start with you. And just you're one of the authors of this book, one out of four, and would love to just hear a little bit about what was behind the book. And I think the question that I wanted to ask you was that these sort of 25 questions that you highlight in the introduction of the book, Wesley's 25.
Right.
What were the connection points between those questions as you knew and understood them and the world around you, and how did it all sort of come together for an Advent study?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you again for having me. It's an honor that you all are studying this book. There's a lot, you all know there's a lot of Advent books out there, new ones that come out every year, and there's a lot you could have chosen. And so the fact that you are doing Almost Christmas is just a delight. So thank you, and thanks for inviting me to join you all tonight. It was back, I believe, in 2018 when Abingdon Press, the publishing house for the United Methodist Church, came to me to see if I would coordinate a group of very gifted pastoral writers to do an Advent study that was rooted in Wesleyanism. That was the only premise they gave. So they asked me if I could run with that, see if we could develop a 4-week series that was based on a Wesleyan Advent perspective. I immediately discovered some quick roadblocks to that, in that Advent was not really practiced too much in the time of John Wesley. Christmas was marginally observed and celebrated. As I say in the introduction to the book, John Wesley did preach some sermons on Christmas Day, but 0 Advent sermons. There was not a formal liturgical period like what we have today of 4 Sundays leading up to Christmas. Not a single Advent sermon. In fact, if you take a look at the lectionary texts that we have, year A, year B, year C, and all of the lectionary texts in Advent that we get to preach and people get to hear every single year, Wesley didn't preach a single one of those texts, except for one. There's a text in Isaiah 11. And so it was, and Abingdon wanted us to do a study based on John Wesley's perspective on Advent. So we had to think creatively, needless to say. And that's when I began a conversation with one of our dear mutual friends, Steve Harper, I go to him for all things, John Wesley. He just informs me so much. And I said, I had a conversation. I said, what if we take the iconic sermon, Almost Christian, which was not an Advent sermon. I hope I make that clear in the introduction, and really make it about how we can prepare our spiritual selves for a fresh arrival of Jesus. In other words, take the essential spiritual components of that sermon and make it Advent-ish. And that seemed to fit. I began the conversation with the publishing house and the other three writers, Ingrid and April and Matt. And we really centered on this idea of taking Almost Christian and making it an Advent study that eventually became the title Almost Christmas. So that was the launching off point. And you ask about the 25 questions, those come from that sermon, Almost Christian. And those are not Advent questions, but they're pretty good.
Yeah.
In terms of preparing ourselves, inviting the Holy Spirit to form us into a readiness for Jesus Christ to be Lord in our lives.
And that's what Advent is all about, right?
Absolutely.
It's all about heart.
So that's where the book came from. Yeah.
Awesome. Hey, did you use those 25 questions as an Advent devotional for yourself? And if you did, how was that experience?
That's a great question. So I did use them because one of the supplemental pieces that was published, you all may know this, one of the supplemental works that was published along with the book is a daily devotional. This sounds like a shameless pitch, but since you asked.
We did ask.
Yeah, the Abingdon Press published this book, which is a daily devotional in which clergy, lay people, thought leaders throughout the connection took one of those 25 questions. So there's like 25 different authors, and they wrote a reflection on it. And I used this for my own personal benefit when I first received a copy of this book. So the very first Advent that this material was out, I followed along with some just incredibly insightful, gifted writers who took each of those questions. So it's a beautiful thing.
Awesome. And for anyone that's interested in picking that up, it's not too late, of course. Please feel free to go ahead and do that. So here's a question. I'm going to throw it out to the whole group this time, and welcome Rachel and Alyce to the conversation. And you point out in chapter 1 how many times the whole "do not be afraid" statement is made, and I wonder sometimes how does that land? You know, it's easy to read those words in Scripture and sort of let them warm the cockles of your heart, but then almost, you know, the reality of "do not be afraid" is quite a command. So maybe Alyce, would you start us off? How do those words land whenever you read them? Do not be afraid.
Well, those three words, or those two words, fear not. I've thought about them, preached about them, and talked about them for a long, long time, because I do believe that when we are in fear, fear is the root of hatred that leads to violence, that leads to destruction of all kinds. So when we live from a place of fear, not only are we subject to those negative things, but in addition, it keeps us from living. It keeps us from trying anything new. And if we're really steeped in irrational fear, we can be paralyzed by it. It can keep us from moving forward in our Christian journey. And we've heard people say, I think we even talked about it in staff meeting, of being at a comfortable place in your Christian journey, and what it would mean to go deeper. What would it mean to want to draw closer to Jesus? What would it mean to surrender more of my will to the will of God? And where would that take me? And I think all of us who've been through the ordination process have had that experience. What will it mean if I say yes to this call? How will my life change? What will it mean for my family? So fear is a very powerful emotion. And powerful leaders use it to manipulate and control. And people who are steeped in some sort of political agenda use it to marginalize and categorize people and isolate people and divide us. So it's a lot to think about. But I think when we see the angel saying to Mary, to the shepherds, to Joseph, fear not, then we know that the Lord does not want us to live from a place of fear, but rather from a place of hope and love.
Thank you, Alyce. Just before we come to Rachel, I'm going to say to everybody who's watching along, I think that's actually a really good question. If you have an answer, you'd like to type it in. How do the words "do not fear" land for you whenever you read them or you hear them in the Advent narratives? So, Rachel, what about you? How do those words land for you?
Well, I think about the idea of the head hearing fear not, and then the bodily response that happens at the same time. So, for example, there was a time when I was flying back and forth between Austin, Texas, and Tampa, that I was on this plane that had probably the worst turbulence I've ever experienced. The plane's going up and down like this. And I'm sitting next to a kid who's like, well, if we make it to the ground. And I'm like, dude, this is not the time to have this conversation. But after that, we know the statistics about flying. We know for the most part that we are safe in turbulence. But every time I would hit turbulence for a flight after that, for months, years, I'm still a nervous flyer, but I would viscerally start to feel it in my body, this fear taking over and this anxiety. And so what is really, I think, an amazing thing is medication. I'm going to say that as an aside for our extreme anxiety. But I think there is the concept when we talk about getting to peace and talking about shalom and about this kind of whole encompassing peace that is within our body, is that when we can relinquish the fear that has a hold even over the physical reactions that we have, then I think we're able to really live into that idea of fear not. Because I can try to reason all I want, right? I'm not afraid. But if my body is reacting in a different way, then clearly there is something still going on.
So there's a sense by which, when the angel says this to all of our Advent friends in the scripture, do not fear, that there may be a part of those characters that is saying, yeah, that's easier said than done.
We sing shepherds quake at the sight. So there is still a bodily response, even as they're listening and being blessed by what's being said.
Yeah. Magrey, tell us, how do those words land for you?
Yeah, the fact that the angel has to make that a standard part of the angel's introduction, even though the angel's bringing good news, usually you're not afraid when good news comes to you, right? But the fact that so many people in these narratives needed to have their fears addressed from the outset is an indication. Actually, it's kind of a liberating thing that even as much as 2,000 years ago, fear was a common human experience in that culture and for individuals. And that is a helpful thing for us to acknowledge, that when we're afraid or worried or anxious, we're not alone. So that's one thing. The other piece, in addition to your beautiful reflections that you just offered, I remember one that came a couple of years ago from our mutual friend, our former bishop, Ken Carter, who during the pandemic would guide all of our congregations, but specifically us clergy, to remind us that when we are interacting with people, whether they're congregants or people out in the community who were experiencing great anxiety or troubledness or unsettledness, that all of us, especially during the pandemic, but this continues, all of us tend to operate from a sense of either grief or fear. He used those two words.
Mm.
And as I have thought about that over the years, I think he's right. Grief and fear, if you think of it as a continuum, grief is an acknowledgement of what we have lost in the past. It's a sense of loss over what we have had. Fear is an acknowledgement or a sense of what we may lose in the future.
Yeah.
So in some ways, they're both pulling us, one toward the past and one toward the future over this sense of loss, which means we are victims, if you will, of a kind of tug of war, a psychic tug of war. One is pulling us back to the past and one is pulling us into the future, which disables us. And this is where I'm going with this, that disables us to fully live in the present. And I think that is an antidote to fear, is to just be as fully present to the moment as we can. There's no quick fix sometimes for fear or worry or anxiety, but one way to address it is to name it and acknowledge it and to just be fully aware and present in the moment, rather than allowing yourself to drift back to the past, which you can't change, or drift toward the future, which you can't control. The only thing you can do is be fully alive, fully aware in the present, which I think is at the heart of peace and shalom, is to just be fully present right now.
I really appreciate that, Magrey. I hadn't thought about grief and fear being on a continuum like that. So that's very insightful. You know, when I think another thought about fear is the self-talk that we do when we're confronted with the visceral reaction to whatever it is that we're fearing, is, to talk to oneself and say, okay, is this a bear that it's about to eat me? Is this a gun pointed at my head? And if the answer to those questions is no, then what's the worst thing that could happen?
Yeah.
And play that out, and it's talk about all those what ifs and realize the unreality of so much of what we're imagining might happen. So that's a tool that I've used to help other people and myself. Is this rational fear or is this irrational fear?
Yeah. Thank you. Hey, I want to feed back to some of the comments coming through here. Jean Robinson says to us, if perfect love casts out all fear, then it stands to reason when I'm living fearful, I'm not living in a place of experiencing God's perfect love for me.
Nice.
We also have, we asked that question, how do these words land? Jeff Miller tells us that God is with us, and that's how he receives those words. Tonda tells us that she feels seen and comforted. Carrie Mack gives Rachel an amen on the blessing of medication. So then Jessica Scott says fear often separates us from God, and the angels are reminding us to stay focused on God's presence. I think that's great. And Sherry Cobb Thompson saying, in Advent, God's about to do something. In my personal life, that something big, good or bad is on the way. Then my prayer is, Lord, be with me. And Margaret Charles, who's in the other room in this house, she said, I have a fear that grips me when anyone asks to speak to me. So do not be afraid. And we got loads more comments there, but I'm going to come back to them in a second. Thank you. Please continue to add them in there. I want to move on to the conversation in the book goes on to this world of anger, and fear and anger are always connected for me. My old mentor in church work and in pastoring is a retired United Methodist clergy by the name of Renee Lawrence. And she always said to me, when people were angry, she just used to say, well, at the root of all anger is fear, right? Mm-hmm. At the root of all anger is fear. And Magrey, you take us into this sort of response to anger and the responses of awareness, acceptance, and action. And I wonder when these, or when a form of these, have been helpful for you. So I want to come to Rachel first, or would that put you on the spot, Rachel?
Well, you can come to me first.
Come on then.
Oh, how have they been helpful for me to think about, well, I don't want to throw it just directly into the political landscape that we've had for the last, 8 years, more than that. But we are operating in a time where so much of what is happening is driven by fear that has manifested and reared its ugly head in some form of anger. People are angry because they've lost their jobs. People are angry because they feel like something is being taken away from them. At the root of all of that is fear. And so as a pastor, as someone who is on the ground in communities where we deal with happy people and angry people, the first thing that we always have to do is be aware of what is it, what is it that people are longing for? What is it that people are desiring? It's not just, some of these fears are very real, but how are we approaching that fear is part of this conversation that we're having. And so, I guess I resonate a lot. Magrey, you had the story about your daughters.
Yeah. Oh, believe me, they love the fact that I included this story in the book.
I'm sure
I'll be owing them for the rest of my life for allowing them.
We love the anecdotes. I was going to say, I have a 3-year-old that you may hear in the background.
Okay, good.
I don't know if I've ever felt more angry sometimes than when I ask him to do something 10 times and then he does it, and then it is something minor later on that blows up, or it is something that is dangerous. And that is truly when my fear over him getting hurt bubbles up into an anger,
right,
that I yell at him. And then I realize I have to face that, take a step back and do similar to what you did, where you acknowledged the anger and then you said, go clean your room. It doesn't necessarily change the root of the anger, but the approach and the way that we react to it is something different.
Absolutely. Thanks,
Rachel.
Rachel.
You're just in training for the teen years.
It's not right.
The best is yet to come, right? Again, listen, I want to throw this into our viewers. Please feel free to comment and answer these questions as we're asking them here. These movements with our anger, and we all experience anger, the awareness and acceptance, and then renewed action that is hopeful and positive in response. How have we seen those in our own lives? And Alyce, I'm going to throw that question at you as well. How have you experienced that?
I want to push back just a little bit on this from the perspective of righteous anger.
Sure.
And whether or not righteous anger is it based in fear or something else? So in this regard, I'm thinking about Jesus in the temple. When he overturned the tables, he was angry and he showed it. But I don't think his anger was rooted in fear. So, I don't have an answer here. I'm just kind of throwing it out there for further exploration. Because I do think there is something called righteous anger that calls us to respond by taking action, whether that's an act of mercy or justice, to right whatever is wrong that has made us angry. So
I think
I'm deviating too much from the script, Charlie.
No, not at all. In fact, that's, guys, I sent questions out last night to our panel. So that's one of the questions that I kind of moved over. But I'm glad you brought it up, because it was one of my questions as I was reading through the chapter was, is all anger bad, or is there such a thing as righteous anger? Magrey, what would you say in response to that?
I really appreciate you bringing that up, Alyce, because absolutely there is justified anger. There is righteous anger. I do quote the great Martin Luther King, who reminds us that peace is not the absence of conflict, it is the presence of justice. And oftentimes the introduction of justice requires a kind of righteous anger that motivates someone to do good, to do right. There is always a shadow side, even to righteous anger. And an anger that, justified or not, becomes detrimental to one's health or to one's relationships, becomes damaging to one's worldview, causes one to become cynical or jaded or whatever it is that affects one's mind and heart and body. So even righteous anger, as justified as it can be, needs to be done in a way, as I think Eugene Robinson said, done in love, done in perfect love. I would also say that there's even, so it sounds like we have different levels of anger. One is the kind of natural instinctive anger that comes when your kids don't clean their room, or when someone cuts you off in traffic. It's understandable anger that still needs to be addressed in a healthy way. There is this righteous anger piece that you're talking about. But Rachel, you began this segment by really identifying a really deep, important, and harmful kind of anger that we might call toxic anger, that is divisive. It's polarizing to the point where it dehumanizes other people, removes a person of their integrity and their worth or their dignity as a human being. And whether that happens in political circles based on political ideology or anything else, you're certainly seeing that in trouble spots around the world right now. That is a kind of anger that is systemic, it is dangerous. And the great thing about shalom that is talked about all throughout the Bible is that it is not just a personal peace that we work to experience when someone cuts us off in traffic. It is a bold, daring, and defiant peace that addresses systemic injustice, that kind of deeply seated toxic theology, toxic anger that is still very much, frankly, it's as evident in our world today as it was 2,000 years ago, embodied in the person of Herod. So there are a lot of different angles to take on this issue of anger related to peace.
There are. Thank you. Thank you all for your responses to that, and just for really developing and opening that segment of our conversation. On page 21 of our books, there was a quote that I was interested in. It says, "The real call of God is to cross the boundaries that divide you from someone else, whether those conflicts are born out of betrayal in your relationships, or disagreements over politics or religion, or differences in race, gender, age, or any number of barriers. We are called to do good." So here was my question in response to that. And we're 4 United Methodist pastors here. We have members of the United Methodist congregation here watching along with us. What boundaries are the people called United Methodists being called to cross today?
Wow.
Let's start with you, Magrey. No pressure.
Yeah. There are a number of barriers that are called simply because we are tasked with the blessed privilege of offering good news to the world.
Right.
And the reason it's good news for people is because there are some people who've not experienced that good news, because they have felt marginalized, oppressed, they felt distant from an experience of God's love. So we can take this in any of a number of directions. We can talk about people who have been harmed by the church, who are formally religious, formally churched. We can talk about people who feel disenfranchised because of their identity and their personhood. We can talk about arguments within the body of Christ itself, based on whatever spectrum of ideology you want to use to label how we are divided from each other. You might even talk about barriers that exist between United Methodism and other denominations, or barriers with other faith traditions that aren't Christian. But here's the thing. The movement of God from the biblical accounts all throughout church history is that the hospitality of God is ever expanding and ever widening. It is not one that is constricting or exclusive. It is one that is always reaching out, breaking down barriers, and widening the circles. That's and that is so stunning. That is so jarring that even when the angels announce the widening hospitality of God, they have to say, "Don't be afraid." So I think that "do not fear" message that we began our conversation with is a message for us to not be afraid to share this good news, to cross barriers where our culture and our ideology would divide us from one to another. That is scary stuff to do. That is
Mhm.
risky.
Mhm.
Sometimes it involves conflict that cannot be avoided. And so we are afraid of that. And so the Advent message for us from the angels is, don't be afraid. We have good news of great joy for all people.
Right,
Mhm.
right.
Mhm.
Thank
Yeah.
you, Magrey. Hey,
Mhm.
Alyce, how would you respond to that question?
Well, it is huge, and it is scary. I'm remembering the George Floyd days when our community began some conversations around race and racial justice. And one of the things that we wanted to do is we wanted to be able to approach our brothers and sisters who are not white, who are not Caucasian, who are not, who are brown or black or any other from any other ethnic background in such a way that we didn't do harm, with the best of intentions, we might do harm. And so I think this is one of the biggest challenges that we have in reaching across an aisle or a divide of any kind is, how do I do this without making things worse, right? How do I do this and demonstrate that I'm coming from a place of love, even if I stumble and even if I don't say the right thing or do the right thing at the right moment? It's hard. And it requires, I think, us to really lean into what that trite phrase, but I loved it, by the way. What would Jesus do? How would Jesus do this? Because, I don't know about any of you, but I think I'm ill-equipped, right? I'm more likely to trip over myself, my tongue, my foot, whatever, and say or do the very wrong thing. So I'm gonna rely on thinking through, if Jesus were in this situation, how would Jesus talk to this person? Yeah.
Thanks, Alyce. As you were talking there, the words coming to my mind in terms of how you cross those boundaries. It is with humility and it is with an openness, and I think that's when we approach someone whose background has been different for whatever reason from my own, then it's important to approach with a willingness to listen, to start from a position of trust, right? This person is telling me their story, right? And I think it's important. Rachel, how about you?
My pastoral care professor at Emory when I was at Candler was Greg Ellison, and he is known for doing fearless dialogues, which is, we always talk about the conversations that we can have in 3 feet. So if you put a yardstick between us, what kind of conversations could we have? But one of the first things that we would do in activity almost every week was we would listen to something, or we would look at a piece of art, or we would do something, and he would ask 3 questions. And one question was, what do you hear? Second question was, who don't you see? And that has always stuck with me in terms of any space that I'm in. Is who is not a part of the conversation. You're probably hearing Austin in the background.
He wants to be part of the conversation.
He's singing something in there. Who don't you see? When we are sitting in our congregation, when we are sitting on a Sunday morning and we look around our sanctuary, who's missing from that community? I think that's a good place to start. I think that goes for, like we were talking about, different types of barriers. One of the greatest gifts that we have is this ecumenical clergy group that we have. And even still, I ask, who's not there? How are we approaching the community in our space? And every pocket, not just the United Methodist Church, but our communities. What do our communities look like, and who's missing from those? I think that's a way to start that question as well, and to go forward with that knowledge and with that awareness.
Thank you. I'm going to do a couple of comments here just as they're coming in. I do want to feedback just on our fear and anger conversation. A couple of comments. We had Sherry Cobb Thompson was cheering on Alyce whenever she talked about righteous anger there. Phyllis then says that that it helps me to remember that anger comes from fear when trying to understand an emotional eruption. Okay,
Yeah.
so that helps think that through. Jean says, I found that often the source of my anger is because I do not feel in control, and that is usually tied to not trusting fully in God. The more I stay tuned into God and trusting Him, the more peace and less angry I am. Okay, and possibly comment of the night so far. Jessica Scott tells us that Leslie Knope reminds us that people yelling is them caring really loudly. So thank you for the Parks and Rec reference there. We have here a comment from Mary Smither about our last conversation. She says that she talked recently in one of the Lunch and Learn lessons about being called. And we said that in whatever we do, as Christians, we are all called to be kind or to do good. And then Sherry Cobb Thompson comes back to affirm, be open to what the person is saying. It is their story. We may have never gone through what they have, but empathy and love are key. That's a solid word, Sherry. Thank you for bringing that to us. I would love us to move our conversation on. There's another quote on page 22 that brought something to my mind as I read there. Magrey, you wrote that Wesley believed that an altogether peace can only come when we commit to doing good all the time in every way with all that we have until the very end. I did include more in the quote and the question that I sent to you, but I just thought I'd love to have a conversation about how hard that is. Okay, read that again. Doing good all the time in every way with all that we have until the very end. I mean, let's have some real talk about how hard that is to walk in the way of Christ in this way. Alyce, what would you say about that?
It's hard. Yeah. We're imperfect, in so many ways. And my mother had this saying, Alyce, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Mm-hmm. So we might have the best of intentions in any kind of circumstance, and something trips us up, and sometimes we don't even know what it is. And we have these regrets. So I think there's a real danger here of, the idea of really wanting to and indeed embracing this notion of doing good to the one who just kicked you in the teeth, doing good no matter what. But I think there's another side to it that at least helps me. And that is, I know that I'm not expected to do this perfectly. I'm only expected to do my best, to be obedient to the best of my ability in the moment. And when I falter and I fail, I fall back on the understanding that I'm forgiven, right? Just get up and press on, And then I think it's also helpful for all of us when we get mired down in the self-condemnation of, I didn't do this right. I failed in this. I did this wrong. I didn't do what I failed to do, what I did wrong. Is to say that we indeed are forgiven, and to look back at where we were in our Christian journeys just a few months or years ago and say, you know what, you are making progress, so it's so easy to beat ourselves up.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Rachel, how about you?
Well, as someone who has grown up with the majority of their life broadcast on social media, I can attest, Alyce, to what I literally was just thinking about. Wow, I'm really glad I'm not the person I was at 15 who was posting what I was posting. And one of the maybe the double-edged swords of social media is that you can go back and you can see all the stupid stuff that you said, and hopefully learn from it. But yeah, I mean that we are given this advantage. Wesley's always setting the bar like
Right.
here, right? And you can look at it and go, this is never attainable. Or you can look at it and say, challenge accepted. I think that there is fruit that comes from aiming high. And in this case, I think that we are ever striving to do good, and we are people who believe in grace. And when we fail, we have to allow ourselves to have that grace as much as we would for someone else. But then we reassess and we keep moving forward.
Right.
One of my former DSs, Tony Fernandez, had this saying. He says, "We serve a God who always makes room for U-turns." Right? And I love that phrase.
I love that. Thank you. And I loved, Wesley sets the bar high, but I love your language there, Rachel. Challenge accepted, Mr. Wesley. I like that. So, Magrey, how about you?
He absolutely sets the bar high. I actually, if I may just read straight from him on this topic, it's at the top of page 22, because what we're going to discover is not only is this hard, it's even harder than we thought. And I'll say what I mean in a minute. He does good, not of one particular kind, but good in general, in every possible way, employing herein all his talents of every kind, all his powers and faculties of body and soul, all his fortune, his interest, his reputation, desiring only that when his Lord cometh, he may say, well done, good and faithful servant. He says this as comprehensively as possible to suggest that not only are we supposed to do good, we are supposed to avoid doing good badly. And by that, I mean, there are ways to do good for others that aren't really that good. When we do good for others in order to feel like we are better than them, or doing good for others in order to expect something in return, or doing good without the best intentions or motivations. I mean, there's lots of things that we can do good for others, but unless they come from holiness of heart as well as holiness of hands, then it's not really transforming us. It may be doing good charitably for other people, but Wesley was really as interested in the transformation of the heart, the mind, as much as he was interested in just doing good for other people. It is an interior journey as much as it is an external journey in terms of holiness. So it is hard, and sometimes it's even harder than we thought.
Thank you, Magrey. Margaret Charles is saying it's hard at times, especially when we get frustrated or scared. And that's a great tie-in actually to everything that we've been talking about so far, right? Marion Groan says it is hard and I have to pray every day for the Lord to help me shine his light and share his love. And Jessica says, agrees with Alyce and talks about going on to perfection. Sherry talks and says life can and will get in the middle. And that's when I have to depend totally on God and lean into him to complete the task. And then Phyllis says, sometimes what is good is not totally clear. And I think sometimes harm can be done when trying to do no harm. That's exactly what you said.
Exactly what I'm saying there. Right.
Awesome. Thank you. Hey, let me take our conversation on because this time is disappearing so quickly. So there's a little bit that we talked about in the book there about the Pax Romana and how that is an almost peace. And Magrey, you've already a couple of times talked about shalom peace.
Yeah.
So I'd really like to sort of tie a couple of those questions that I gave to you into one. Where do we see this Pax Romana in the world today, this sort of almost peace? And then what does shalom peace look like for us, particularly here in the United States, in Florida? What does this shalom, this altogether peace that we're talking about look like? Let me maybe come to Rachel first on that.
Man, you gave me the hard one. This is so I go to page 25 to talk about shalom. There are a few places in in this that I have underlined. One is, if we look at the broad, it's at the top of the page. Mama's tapping, baby. If we look at the broad biblical witness, we find that shalom often envisions the whole and complete restoration of all creation.
Yes.
And then you go into the next paragraph. It says shalom doesn't just mean the absence of conflict or trouble. It points to the fullness of health and prosperity for oneself and for others. And here's Austin.
He is welcome.
He is absolutely welcome.
He's clean. He's here.
He's alive.
Why?
It's all good.
I think that when I hear of, it points to the fullness of health and prosperity for oneself and others. Shalom is, it's deeper than just being nice to someone, to listening to someone. It is truly looking at another person. It is looking at the humanity of another person and saying, I care as much about this person, that I want them to be happy. I want them to be healthy. What are the systems that are causing them harm? Because it's actually causing harm to all of us. So when I think of the United States, I'm going to just pick on like the maternity leave. That's the only, and let me just preface and say that the UMC has really good maternity leave in comparison. But, you know, when women are provided and only 2 weeks of maternity leave in some situations, or other parents aren't even, given anything. What is that doing for a society as a whole? So shalom is not only just looking at how we treat each other, but it's how we are approaching systems and responding to those systems.
Thank you. Alyce,
I want to talk about Pax Romana because it's an oxymoron. It's not peace at all. The trains may run on time, but it is a peace that is only possible with ultimate control and rigid punishments for those who deviate, even in the smallest way, to express any kind of their own individuality or humanity. That was the Roman peace. That was the Nazi peace. And there are those in the world today who, because they fear dissension, they fear dialogue, they fear differences, their ultimate wish is to ultimately control so that they can have the peace that they seek by being in control. And so when we are looking at shalom, that too is hard because, like it or not, we all want some kind of control. We want self-control. We want to make our own decisions in our own way. We sometimes want to control our families, not because of some sinister motive, but because we want to keep them safe, right? So we're all subject to this in one degree or another. And the challenge of attaining shalom is to really get to that place where you can say, I'm okay. And guess what? I'm okay with you too. You're different. Maybe you're even scary to me, but I'm going to rest in the peace that Paul talks about, whether I live or whether I die. I know whose I am. I know where I am. I know where I'm going to be. And with that knowledge, can I not then say to that one who is so different, maybe scary, that I would like to control, that I'm going to tolerate, I'm going to coexist with you. I'm going to be curious rather than afraid. And I'm going to embrace the difference. That's as hard as all these other things that we've talked about the doing good.
Yeah, I was in with a group this afternoon, and we were just talking about the paradox of the Christian faith, and that It's easy to accept, Christ and all that Christ has given to us, but the act of following Christ is just hard, right? Because it calls from us that which does not come naturally to us. Magrey, what would you say about that?
Well, there's little I can add substantively to what both of you have said. I would condense it the best I can to say that the Pax Romana is an absence of conflict based on a power differential in a society. Shalom is the presence of justice based on shared power.
Right.
And that's why the biblical concept of shalom and the biblical concept of justice are so interrelated, because in the Hebrew mind, justice, the word tzedek, is God's action of inverting the power differential, of inverting the power structure and actually equalizing shared power among all people. That's what leads eventually to shalom. And so you can translate that in any of a number of ways to our world today. If it seems peaceful, but it's based on power differential, it's not true peace. If it's based on shared power, then that is a closer vision to shalom.
Yeah, and listen, as a man born and raised in Northern Ireland, where power is shared these days, that's hard too.
It's hard too,
and doesn't always work. Doesn't always seem like it's working, but to continue seeking to make that the reality is a good thing.
Right.
A couple of comments. We have lots of hellos to Austin there, so I just want to make sure
he's the true star of the show.
True star of the show.
What would Advent be without a baby? That's what
Jean says to us that the Roman peace reminds me of the kind of peace people think they will find in a political solution. The peace that brings wholeness only comes from loving God and loving others and relying on God. Thank you for that. And Sherry Cobb Thompson says, Pax Romana in Florida in education, what could be taught and punishment if it is if it is violated. And then Art says the distance from hopelessness to peace is a valley of despair.
Oh, wow.
And, thank you. That's a profound comment there from Art. Hey, we have about 6 more minutes left, and I would love to get a couple of questions in the last 2 questions actually on your paper there. The first one is on page 29, Magrey, you say unity from diversity is a lot closer to the heart of God. And I just wonder if you might say a little bit more about that to us. Unity from diversity is a lot closer to the heart of God. What would you say about that?
I can remember the context in which I was originally thinking about this and why I brought Ephesians into an Advent book. Because the publishing house reached out to us to write this book in the lead up to General Conference 2019. And so many of the denominational leaders, including the bishops, were encouraging us to really do a deep dive with our congregations on Ephesians, particularly that chapter I talk about in the book. And so as I was thinking about all that and thinking about peace, the denominational struggles were heavily on my mind. And so they were really pushing this idea of unity amidst our diversity. And it's still a noble thing to pursue, even though we all know what's developed in the denomination. It is still a good value to hold, not just in our congregations, but in our society, to celebrate our differences and also focus on what holds us together.
Yeah. In the interest of time, I'm gonna just move us right to the last question there, because I'd love us to have 5 minutes with it. On page 32, Magrey, you write these words. Paul is so passionate about getting this right. Why? Because he believes that if the church gets it right, then the world can get it right. If followers of Jesus can model a different way to seek unity amid our diversity, then maybe the world can discover a better way. And maybe we can discover peace, real, altogether peace amid our conflict. My question for you all is this: how can we, the church, awaken anew to this call today? And I'm going to start with Alyce on that one.
Well, as I was thinking about both of these questions, I was thinking, I once worked for the Department of Environmental Protection. I'm not an environmental scientist, but I am a lover of learning. And the more I learn about the diversity in creation and how within that diversity there is unity, and how the biodiversity of interrelatedness and interdependence of living things, like even here on our island, I learned something about the wax myrtle. It's a plant of little importance, I guess, unless you happen to be a critter. And that one single plant has enormous impact on the health of the environment in which it lives. Now, that might seem off topic, but I don't think so, because God created this world with enormous, incredible, unfathomable diversity. And God loves diversity. And when you see the unity in nature, nature offers us an example to get it right. You know, we don't have to destroy in order to survive or thrive. Maybe we need to look at it differently.
Wow.
So from that one perspective, you know, there's so much that we can learn from outside the traditional theological realms about this subject of diversity and unity and diversity. And I think maybe we should explore it a little bit further.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you. Rachel, how about you?
It is not lost on me. I mean, it says if followers of Jesus can model a different way to seek unity, then maybe the world can discover it. It is not lost on me that we can say, I am a follower of Jesus, and someone else can also say they're a follower of Jesus and be following two different things, calling themselves the church, and that outsiders or folks who are not a part of the church see that and then put us all under an umbrella. And that makes our work a lot harder, which means that we are, I agree. I think that as followers of Jesus, if we can do this work, then other people will see that and also want to do this work and say, hey, I want to buy into what they're doing. But that starts in a really hard place. And that starts with the folks who also are saying they follow Jesus, who may not be following Jesus, and who's to say that they are or are not. But I think that's some of the work that has to be done, because the witness of the church is being cast in a light that is pushing people away from pursuing this kind of peace.
Thank you.
So I sit with that a lot.
All right. No, I think it's valuable. Magrey, what would you say?
I don't think it's any surprise. It shouldn't be a surprise to us that in just a matter of verses in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says both, blessed are the peacemakers, and you are the light of the world, and you are the salt of the earth. Efforts to build, create peace do impact the lives of other people who are watching us. It is the witness of the church. It is the good news that we're called to proclaim.
Yeah. And I think people listen to what we do a lot better than what we say. Yeah. And that's our witness. It's not necessarily what we're saying, it's what we're doing. You know, it is that walking the talk. It is that loving beyond our own capacity to love when there are those who are unlovable and those who are really undeserving and those who are, you know, so far away from what we would want to embrace. And that's the hardest part of all. And it's why I kind of chose to talk about the diversity of nature, because it's a neutral ground for people. You know, if we can use nature as our examples of, you know, coexistence and interdependence. I love that word, interdependence, because we are all dependent on one another. None of us stands alone. So to be able to demonstrate to the people with whom we come in contact one by one, because that's how we do it, really, is one by one. The ones that we come in contact with, that goes so much further than any kind of big broadcasting thing that we do. So I know I'm rambling a lot on this, rambling around the mulberry bush, but it does start with us. It's like that hymn, "Let there be peace on earth, and let it begin with me."
That's right. And that's a comment, certainly, Magrey, that you make in chapter 1 there, that this peace, this shalom, starts here. It's an inner work, and it's an inner work that then works out beyond ourselves and our connections one with the other. Guys, this has been so much fun. I could sit here for another hour with you, but I promised Magrey it was 60 minutes and then we're done. And there's people watching faithfully at home, and we promised them 60 minutes too. I want to thank everybody at home for their comments and for their interactions. This recording will be available on Memorial's YouTube channel pretty soon. I don't know if that'll go up tonight or tomorrow, but it will become available there, so you can watch back if you want to. Magrey, thank you so much for writing this.
Absolutely.
So
It's
much
been
for your
fun.
time and for indulging us with your thoughts and reflections on these questions tonight. Is there anything you want to say to us before we finish?
Blessed Advent to you all. What a gift you are to your community, and thank you for including me as part of it.
Oh, thank you. Listen, thank you all. God bless you all. We'll be back next week, 6:30 again for week 2 of our study. So please, we'll see you then.
Magrey, thank you so much for your
Oh,
generosity.
thanks, Alyce, Rachel. Thanks, Charlie. You have a wonderful congregation there. It's amazing.